Good morning and welcome to Trip the Beltway. Fantastic. My name is Kelley Vlahos and I am the editor-in-chief at Responsible Statecraft. I'm here with my producer in the back end, Christopher Leonard, and two of some of my favorite people here, Ben Freeman and Nick Cleveland-Stout. Before we go further, if you like what you see today, please hit subscribe and the like button. It really will help us grow our audience at Trip the Beltway. Fantastic. So thank you very much for being here this morning. I would like to introduce my friends. These two are gumshoes in their own right and form. And, along with Bill Hartung, they form up a pretty kick-ass crew called the Democratizing Foreign Policy Unit at the Quincy Institute. They are responsible for the thinktanktracker.org, which is the best way for journalists and citizens and journalist citizens to find out what foreign government, defense company, or U.S. government agency is funding what foreign policy think tank in D.C. Ben is the director of the DFP program and co-author with Bill Hartung of the $1 Trillion War Machine. So check that book out. And Nick has been pumping out reams of research on Israeli lobbying and foreign influence and U.S. foreign policy and media, much of what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you guys for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure, Kelley.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pleasure seeing both of your smiling faces. We've worked together for a long time and just honored to be a colleague. Ben, let's talk first about Section 219, which was Section 224 up until last week of the National Defense Authorization Act bill. You were the first to break the news into the mainstream consciousness in May. Basically, it gives Israel unprecedented access to the Pentagon, including our defense manufacturing and technology. There's been such an uproar about this that some members of Congress, Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, are vowing to strip it from the final bill. But considering the entrenched pro-Israel preferences in the majority, they have a hard road ahead. So let's first take a look at Cut 1, Chris.
The American people are tired of the arrogance and insolence of Prime Minister Netanyahu telling America what we should do. The entire country of Israel has a GDP that is less than a single town in my district. Yet somehow Netanyahu thinks he could tell the American people what we should do. The person who's most upset with him right now is President Donald Trump. And everyone in America, whether you're a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat, says that we need to tell Netanyahu that America calls the shots, not the prime minister of any other country. They want less cooperation and blank checks to Israel, not more.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is nothing more than a political stunt to remove a critical bipartisan provision that I was proud to craft with multiple members across both sides of this committee to get included in this year's bill. Plain and simple, Section 224 will allow the U.S. to leverage advanced technologies that ensure our service members are prepared to fight and win against America's adversaries by designating a Department of War executive agent to synchronize defense cooperation efforts between the U.S. and our strongest ally in the Middle East, Israel. The provision will allow us to expand and accelerate bilateral defense technology, research, development, testing, and evaluation, fielding, and industrial cooperation. A relationship this committee has supported and reinforced over many NDAAs, but also ensures that we are turning our previous and current investments into real technological military advantages for U.S. systems and warfighters.
Ben, can you tell us what is at stake here?
Yeah, Section 224 and now 219, this U.S. Israel military industrial complex integration model, which is really what we're talking about here. This would be an unprecedented tightening of the U.S. Israel military relationship. As they mentioned in the clip there, it would first and foremost create this executive agent within the Pentagon who answers directly to the Secretary of Defense, whose sole responsibility would be further integrating the U.S. and Israel military-industrial sectors. Now, that's extraordinary because no other U.S. ally, not our NATO allies, not UK, not Australia, not Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, you name it, no other country in the world has an executive agent in the Pentagon who fulfills that kind of role. So what they're proposing here for Israel would absolutely be extraordinary. And despite the proponents' argument that, oh, this is just business as usual, there's no question about it. This is unprecedented.
Okay. We have the Section 219, which, as you mentioned, it affords this unprecedented access. What about the Tom Cotton bill, that Section 22 on the Senate side? Sponsored by the senator, that focuses on intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Israel, which our colleague Paul Pillar calls bizarre. It would require the president acting through the director of national intelligence and, as necessary, the secretary of defense to, quote, expand and enhance intelligence sharing with the government of Israel on a list of subjects that encompasses almost every topic of intelligence interest in the Middle East. What's going on here?
Well, if Section 224 didn't scare you, this intelligence provision really should scare you. Because as Paul very eloquently pointed out in Responsible Statecraft, this too is incredibly unprecedented intelligence provision. And it's called the U.S. Israel Intelligence Enhancement Act, but it's a complete misnomer. This is an intelligence requirement provision. There's no enhancement to it. It requires the U.S. to share intelligence with the government of Israel. And it even goes beyond that and says it puts in place measures that would make it very hard to turn off that spigot of intelligence. It would require the President of the United States to come to Congress and effectively plead with Congress and have to make the case for why they were shutting off this spigot of intelligence with the government of Israel. And now, again, as I said with Section 224, the executive agent, that's unprecedented. This too, this intelligence provision, is also unprecedented. We don't have any sort of intelligence requirement like this with other countries. To be clear, we have plenty of intelligence sharing agreements with our NATO allies, the Five Eyes countries, of course, but none of those are these sort of locked-in requirements that really tie the hands of future presidents. So, with all of this, you have to ask yourself, is it smart right now when we have
now that it's just moving into the shadows? I would gather that is your assessment on why this is all happening at this very moment?
That's my assessment, and that is one analyst named Benjamin. This military, industrial integration model, there's no cap on it. This could be $3.8 billion as well. It could be $6.8 billion. It could go on up and up and up. There's no ceiling to the level of integration here. And I think Netanyahu knows that. And he knows that the more our military industrial sector gets in bed with the Israeli industrial sector, that only ties the hands of future presidents and future members of Congress even more than they already are.
Right, and anybody who's been following the Pentagon procurement acquisitions budget process knows that it is a rabbit hole, a rabbit warren, and it'd be very difficult to have eyes on every single contract that Israel is involved in. And even if you did, it's not as though each of those contracts is going to be up for some sort of congressional approval or oversight.
Right. Congress does have some control over some of this. Congress still has the power of the purse and that sort of thing. But this executive agent that Section 224 would create, that's not a congressionally approved position. The Senate does not have to confirm that position. That position is appointed by the Secretary of Defense and reports not to Congress, but to the Secretary of Defense. Their only reporting to Congress comes in an annual report that sums up everything that they've already done. And that's a key distinction between this model that Netanyahu calls my plan and the current aid model. The current aid model requires the money to be approved by Congress in advance. Under this new system, Congress only gets full disclosure of what's going on after the money has already taken place. And huge for Israeli influence in America.
Yeah, that's crazy. Nick, let's bring you in here. So as we've kind of hinted at, a lot of this has to do with Israel's declining image in America's eyes. As they've become more frustrated about that, they've upped their game in trying to influence media narratives and messaging here in the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been very clear that this is a separate front in their war. Let's take a look at cut 2, Chris.
The weapons change over time. You can't fight today with swords. That doesn't work very well. But we have to fight with the weapons that apply to the battlefields in which we're engaged. And the most important ones are on social media. And the most important purchase that is going on right now is
Followers.
TikTok, number one. And I hope it goes through because it can be consequential.
We have seen the deterioration of the support for Israel in the United States almost, I would say it correlates almost 100% with the geometric rise of social media. We have several countries that basically manipulated social media with bot farms, with fake addresses to break the American sympathy to Israel, to break the American-Israeli alliance because they think it's in their interests. And that's something that has hurt us badly. While we were fighting the physical military battle on 7 battlefields, 7-front war, we were completely exposed on the 8th front, the media war, really the social media war.
Nick, your research has revealed that the Israeli government has now given tens of millions of dollars to Brad Parscale, former Trump campaign guy, now media marketing guru, to engage a multimedia campaign to win over the hearts and minds of Americans back to their positions on Israel and in Israel. Can you break down for us what that relationship is between the Netanyahu government and Brad Parscale and his media holdings and what all that money is paying for?
For sure, yeah. So Brad Parscale was first awarded, I think, a $6 million contract in September of 2025, last year. And at the time, it was, a massive contract. But it is ballooned to what appears to be just short of $50 million in the course of 1 year. $50 million. So Parscale is by far, far and away the most important contractor for the Israeli government. And there are 3 kind of main things that Parscale, who, former Trump campaign manager, is doing on Israel's behalf. So the first is that he is the chief strategy officer for Salem Media, which is this massive Christian media conglomerate. It produces a number of shows like the Scott Jennings shows, the Hugh Hewitt shows, and then a lot of local broadcasts that people tune into on their way to work. And so part of his job is to integrate pro-Israel narratives into Salem Media. It literally says that in his contract. So that's one of the things he's doing. And he's also funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Salem Media as well. The second bucket is that he is creating a lot of websites in order to try and influence the ways in which, generative chatbots, places like companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, Claude and ChatGPT, the way that they interpret information. These kinds of chatbots, they scrape data from all corners of the internet. And so Parscale realized that if he just created a lot of websites that are very pro-Israel, and especially ones that try to stick to the facts, this is the historic U.S. Israel relationship. Here's all the amazing things that the U.S. has gotten out of this relationship. These are the kinds of things that he says on these websites. Then, maybe those kinds of chatbots will scrape that data and incorporate it into the answers the next time, someone who is just curious, tell me about the situation in Israel, what's going on, and is Israel's war in Iran and the bombing in Lebanon justified? Maybe the next time they ask that question, it'll give a response that is influenced by Parscale and his company. And then the third bucket that Parscale is kind of doing is he's leading this mass texting campaign. And he'll reach out, his company will reach out to what appears to be millions and millions of Americans. I know a lot of people who have been contacted by this campaign, and the texts are fairly innocuous at first. They'll say, hey, my name is Matt, I'm with an organization called Partners in Peace, and I'd love to talk to you about the U.S. Israel relationship. And the idea is that over the course of this texting conversation, and a lot of people don't even realize that it's bots or that it's the state of Israel that's carrying this out. But the idea is that over the course of this conversation, that Parscale will be able to convince people to be a little bit more pro-Israel. The company that's carrying out that contract on behalf of Parscale, it's a subcontractor, says that they have a very high persuasion rate and that they can reach millions and millions of Americans. And so these are the three kind of main things that Israel is getting out of this contract with Parscale. But so that's great. More transparency is good. We can at least look into which firms he's paying. There are plenty of people that are part of that contract that it appears as though they don't want the association with working with the government of Israel, which can carry a toxic label even in Republican circles these days. I mean, just to give one example, like there's one of his longtime allies, GOP strategist named Mike Shields. It's his company called Convergence Media that's actually staffing that contract with Parscale. But Shields, his company isn't listed anywhere in the FARA filings. Also, there's most of the payments to Shields are through this shadowy firm that he created that there's no public information about. It's called Portman Road Strategies. So I think that in a lot of circles, working for Israel is seen as fairly toxic, and so there carries a reputational weight to it as well. And so Parscale is kind of the one putting his name out there. But there are plenty of places that don't want that association. And so a lot of my reporting, it's not just based on FARA documents, but there are plenty of Israeli procurement documents, for instance, documents that you can find just going to Israeli procurement databases that detail American contractors that are being paid as part of this big information war that don't register under FARA. And just to give one example, there's a Christian Zionist organization called Eagle's Wings that was paid $700,000 by the Israeli government in part to carry out what they called Israel Advocacy Day, which took place last month. And they were on the Hill, this organization, they were on the Hill with a bunch of volunteers meeting with over 100 different congressional offices, and they were explicitly lobbying on the U.S. Israel military relationship. Exactly what Ben is talking about. And they aren't registered under FARA at all. And experts that I spoke to, FARA lawyers, FARA experts, they all said that this is pretty textbook FARA, pretty textbook case of FARA registration.
Wow.
If I could just jump in there, Kelley,
Yeah.
I think that what Nick has identified in these campaigns is critically important because it's a lack of transparency. And now the reason we have our lobbying disclosure laws on the books, the reason we have the Foreign Agents Registration Act is to provide transparency when foreign governments, foreign actors try to influence U.S. political process. FARA doesn't pick winners and losers. There's no First Amendment, there's no you can say this, but you can't say that under FARA. there's no First Amendment, there's no speech prohibitions under it. All it is a transparency statute that says if you're doing this type of work in the U.S., you've got to register, got to disclose what you're doing. And critically, when you're sending something out, if you're one of these influencers that's putting out some of these tweets that Nick is talking about or other social media posts, and you're doing it on behalf of the government of Israel, you got to let your viewers, your subscribers know that you're being paid by the government of Israel to do that. By them not doing that, these campaigns, they take on a covert, secretive type of feel to them that honestly, to me, makes me more worried than if they had just disclosed it in the first place.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, Ben, because you have been covering foreign influence for as long as I've known you. And when we started working together, you were more or less focused on Saudi Arabia, UAE, some of these Persian Gulf, these, these big oil monarchies who had really searched.
Registered under FARA. And so, if you were looking at the Israel lobby and you were looking at FARA, it was pretty boring. And that was really true up until October 7th. And really, even after that, when public opinion started to shift against him. And that's why I think Nick's work is so valuable right now. He has tracked that transition, almost in real time. Some of the reporting that Nick has done, I can't say enough about how important this is. Nick will get a document, and then, that same day, he's putting an article up in Responsible State. Breaking this critically important news. Our other colleague, too, we'd be remiss in any conversation about the Israel lobby if you don't mention the name Eli Clifton.
Yep.
You're making a mistake. Our colleague Eli Clifton has a wonderful new book coming out here in a couple months about the Israel lobby as well. Both of these gumshoes, way nerdier than me when it comes to the Israel lobby, frankly. They are doing critically important work now. They have tracked this transition to a phenomenal degree from the AIPAC dominant era to the now kind of the Brad Parscale dominant era, where they're using these FARA registered firms more than they ever have before.
Yeah, Nick, I wanted to ask you about that because as a consumer of media, I've gotten some of these texts that you talked about, but I'm also, I'm following a lot of, conservative influencers, podcasters, people posting stuff on X. And what you did with one article that you wrote for Responsible Statecraft, you revealed that in one of these contracts, they were actually paying influencers I think it was $7,000 a post. And this went viral, your article, because it started to dawn on people that what they were hearing from influencers, what they were reading in right-wing media mostly, could have been paid for by the Israeli government, and they didn't know because it wasn't disclosed. Can you talk a little bit about how that has infected the media ecosystem, paid postings, and how widespread is this?
Yeah, so there's kind of two dimensions to this. There's the Israeli government trying to, directly pay influencers, that 7,000 article, and also running tons of ads with the likes of Google and Meta and X. That's all designed like direct pay to play. They're trying to get their word out there, and especially with the influencers posting on behalf of Israel, it's especially concerning given that that's not disclosed, right? This is kind of FARA is a very old statute. Designed in early 20th century, right, or mid 20th century, and so it's not ready for the 21st century. It hasn't really been updated, and so that disclosure just isn't there. Usually, you're supposed to include a statement that details, this is a paid post, the same way you would see if if someone is posting, has a paid partnership with Nike and they're advertising a pair of shoes or something, and it'll say, this is a paid advertisement. That just doesn't really happen for foreign influence. In theory, you're supposed to, and some people do. Former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, every time he posts on social media, he always says that he is a paid lobbyist for Republika Srpska. That's the kind of transparency that we need, frankly. But yeah, so this is a point that Marjorie Taylor Greene and others have made online in reaction to these influencers being paid, is that we just don't know who they are. But the other thing is that Israel is also embarking on this strategy of trying to court influencers more broadly. Bringing them to Israel, bringing them on these paid junkets in which they can dictate who they're meeting with, where they're going, what they're seeing, what they're not seeing. I've spoken to some of these influencers who have been on these trips, and they've basically said that they probably are aware that this is to some degree a paid propaganda junket, that the Israeli government is determining what they see, but that ultimately it's a free trip, and maybe they already agree with the narrative. There was one influencer who actually went on one of these trips and spoke to some outlet and basically said, I was anti-Israel before going on this trip, and after this trip I'm more okay with sending them weapons. And that's exactly the kind of and that is almost a direct quote. And that is exactly the kind of reaction that they want to get from a lot of these influencers, building support for things like Section 224, now Section 219. They're obviously not going to be inundating them with the policies, the specific amendments and sections and things that they want, but they're selling a narrative.
Right.
And I do think, and part of it also is that they're doubling down on this strategy of this information war, rather than reckoning to some degree with the fact that public opinion in the U.S. is cratered in response to Israel's military actions. There's actually a moment in that 60 Minutes interview in which the interviewer kind of pushes Netanyahu a little bit and says, to the extent that CBS will, and asks him, is it possible to some degree that Americans are organically turning against Israel, or becoming a little bit more skeptical of the U.S. Alliance with Israel? And Netanyahu is very clear that he at least publicly, he doesn't see that as a reality. And so if you are convinced that the only response that you have is investing more and more money, doubling down on public diplomacy, this information war, this view that social media is the most important weapon of our time, then of course what you're going to do is you're going to quadruple the public diplomacy budget, which is what they did from 2025 to 2026. Now it's at over $750 million a year.
Wow.
I'm just jumping to say it's very costly to have a terrible foreign policy.
That's true.
You see this with Israel right now. We've seen it before in the foreign influence landscape. Saudi Arabia's disastrous war in Yemen, the brutal murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, that leads them to have to spend tens of millions of dollars on campaign. Other countries too, we see this. Israel is just experiencing it firsthand. You have a catastrophic foreign policy that's costing U.S. service members their lives, pulling the U.S. military into a foreign war that's led to attacks on U.S. military bases all over the Middle East. There's no surprise that U.S. public opinion is adamantly opposed to Israel. And so now what we're seeing through this influence campaign that Nick has so very well documented, Israel is paying the price to try and counteract that. But the fact of the matter is, you can't buy your way out of a genocide. You can't buy your way out of this catastrophic U.S. foreign policy approach here. So regardless of how much Israel spends on this, at some point, Netanyahu himself, the Israeli government, is going to have to right the ship and create a better foreign policy and a better relationship with the U.S.
That you are so correct, Ben. I guess my last question would be, we have a generation, the younger Gen Z generation is just very astute and very skeptical of what they're consuming in the media. Has Israel overshot its mark in the sense that you have people absorbing and this media, whether it be podcasts or radio shows and YouTube, and saying, this is all fake news. This is all being paid for, because on one hand, they see the reporting that's out there. They see the critique of it. And, there's this sense that everything is fake. Does this blow back in the faces of Israel? Like, I get it that they're sending influencers over and then they come back all gung ho to support what they the Israeli policy, but does that translate in actually convincing the younger generation of that truth?
It's a really important question, and it's amazing when you're looking at. Like, you even have some Israeli ministers admitting that they don't really have much of a strategy for their public diplomacy right now, because you look at the press releases. They say, "Oh wow, look at how many people we're reaching. Look how many interviews we've given. Look at how influential we are." But then, how has that influenced public opinion? What is that actually getting them? Because, as you rightly mentioned, Israel is earning this reputation for consistently making things up. As we saw, for instance, with the hunger crisis, the famine in Gaza. They sent a bunch of influencers there, and they basically said, nothing to see here. There's no one is going hungry, and that's happening time and time again. And so they are. You're right. Like, a lot of people now, especially young people who have seen all of these images coming out of Gaza and now southern Lebanon, and Iran as well, and just saying that, and just thinking, this doesn't match with what the Prime Minister's office spokesperson is telling me, or what Netanyahu is saying publicly about what's going on in these places. They're insisting that these are all defensive actions. This doesn't look like defensive action to me, and so I think it's difficult for people to want to believe Netanyahu in that case, and so very understandably. And so I think it's totally reasonable that a lot of this could be counterproductive, even not just ineffective, but counterproductive, because we keep seeing public opinion go down and down and down. There are actually Gallup has been running polls for Americans, asking American views on Israel for a very long time, and I think for the first time, Gallup actually now has found that more Americans sympathize with Palestinians over Israelis, and so that's sort of where we are, and of course those numbers are even more stark when it comes to younger Americans, and they've also lost a lot of support among Republicans, evangelicals, base groups, demographics that historically have been the base for the support of the U.S. Israel relationship.
I mean, I would just add, and Nick's spot on. I think I would just add to that, Kelley, that when it comes to transparency isn't just a one-way street. We're not clamoring this, just for the American people's sake. We certainly are. I think that's important. Transparency is important for the foreign governments themselves in terms of their influence operations. The more foreign governments hide and engage in secret, non-transparent espionage, full-on espionage type activities that we're seeing from Israel right now too. The more they do that sort of stuff, the less we're going to trust them. And so if you're the Israeli government right now, you want the American public to trust you, give them a reason to trust you. Stop doing all of these non-transparent, these secret, these clandestine things to try and hoodwink the American public. They're not buying it, and you're only going to lose more of them.
I'm gonna let it go there, because that's the actual crux of the issue here, and I'm so glad that you articulated that, Ben and Nick, and thank you so much for sharing all of your reporting and research and analysis with us on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic. I hope you'll come back on again as things develop. And I also like to thank the audience for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or iHeartRadio or Apple Pods, please give us a good review. And of course on YouTube, please subscribe, Substack as well. We need all of you to make this a bigger and bigger community. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, and we will see you next week.